The sound of her palm striking my face was not a crack, but a wet, solid thud. It was the sound of something soft and final. But it was the laughter that followed that truly unmoored me. It wasn't joyous or humorous. It was a predatory sound, the kind of laughter that crawls into your chest, finds the softest parts of your dignity, and begins to gnaw. I stood there, the sting blossoming across my cheek like a toxic flower, and I stared at her. Lillian, my wife. Her face was a mask of smug satisfaction, her eyes alight with a cruel triumph, as if she had just landed the winning blow in a game only she was playing. Beside her, Marcus, yes, her boyfriend, was grinning, a wide, vapid grin of a man who believes he's just won the lottery. Around them, their acolytes, a collection of shrill voices and sharp, predatory faces, erupted in a chorus of derision that echoed off the high ceilings of the lavish, unfamiliar living room. Let me rewind. This was not the desperate, heat-of-the-moment act of a wife pushed to her limit. Oh no. This was a performance, calculated and rehearsed. At least, she thought it was. You see, Lillian had been seeing Marcus behind my back for months. It wasn't a secret I had just stumbled upon. I had known for weeks. I had gathered the knowledge, piece by painful piece, and instead of confronting her, instead of indulging in the messy, tearful explosion she probably expected, I waited. I observed. I became an anthropologist studying the decay of my own marriage. I watched her lie to my face with an artist's precision, her voice smooth as she spoke of late nights at the office or spontaneous catch-ups with old friends. All the while I knew she was slipping into his car, into his life, playing the role of the faithful wife only when it was convenient. So why was I here? Standing in this ostentatious house I didn't recognize, surrounded by a pack of hyenas who looked at me like I was the punchline to a long, elaborate joke? Because I needed her to show me. I needed her to drop the mask completely, to let the rot underneath show, to reveal the absolute depths of her betrayal. And, bless her cold, hollow heart, she delivered a masterpiece. She slapped me because I dared to exist in her fantasy. I was the ghost at the feast, the unwelcome dose of reality that threatened to shatter the fragile illusion of her consequence-free double life. I had walked into that room without warning, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, but my face a placid lake. I had taken a moment to scan the scene, a tableau of casual betrayal. Lillian, curled on a white leather sofa next to him, her hand resting on his thigh with an easy, proprietary air, as if I were a stranger who had wandered in off the street. Marcus, for his part, had smirked at me. It was a look of pure, unadulterated ownership. A look that said, asterisk, she is mine. You are nothing, asterisk. I'd barely opened my mouth to speak when Lillian had sprung to her feet, a caricature of righteous indignation. And then, the slap. What are you doing here, Michael? She spat, her voice dripping with a contempt so potent it was almost tangible. You don't belong here. The room exploded. I remember locking eyes with Marcus over her shoulder. He didn't even try to hide his amusement. He reveled in it. Look at him, he said, leaning back as if I were a particularly entertaining bit of dinner theater. Can you believe this guy? Walking in here like he owns the place. A volcano of rage threatened to erupt within me, to scald them all with its fury. But I held it back. I packed it down, deep inside. I would not give them the satisfaction of a scene. Instead, I reached into the breast pocket of my jacket and pulled out my watch, an old, simple timepiece my father had given me. A quick glance. 4 minutes left. 4 minutes until the real performance began. I didn't explain myself. What was the point? They weren't listening. They were too busy basking in the warm, putrid glow of their own arrogance. You're pathetic, Lillian said, her voice rising above the din of laughter. No wonder I had to find someone else. Look at you. Just standing there like a lost puppy. Do you even have anything to say for yourself? I did, but not yet. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting their mockery wash over me. The laughter was starting to wane now, the sharp edges dulling into curious murmurs. They were waiting for me to break, to scream, to lash out. I was not going to give them the show they paid for. I had something far better planned. I looked at Lillian, really looked at her, past the makeup and the expensive dress. And for a fleeting moment, I felt nothing. No love, no anger, not even sadness. Just a strange, hollow detachment, The feeling an astronaut must have looking down at a world he can no longer touch. Enjoy this moment, I said, my voice steady, calm, and clear. Because it's the last one you'll have. That silenced them. For a breath, the room was utterly still. Then Marcus broke the spell with a deep, condescending chuckle that spread through his sycophants like a virus. You hear that, Lil? He's making threats now. What a tough guy. I checked my watch again. 3 minutes. I allowed a small, knowing curve to touch my lips. Then, with a languid grace that I did not feel, I walked over to their ridiculously expensive bar, poured myself a glass of their overpriced single malt, and sat down in an empty armchair. I waited. The slap didn't matter. The laughter was just background noise. In 3 minutes, their world was going to end. I swirled the amber liquid in the heavy crystal tumbler, the ice clinking like a tiny, distant bell. I pretended to savor the peaty aroma, playing the part of a man at ease. In truth, the adrenaline coursing through me was so potent it blotted out all other senses. 3 minutes. Just 180 seconds of this grotesque theater before I brought the house down. You might wonder why I didn't scream, why I didn't flip the table and demand the answers I already had. Believe me, the primal urge was there, a caged animal clawing at my ribs. But an outburst would have been a gift to them. It would have validated their narrative of me as the pathetic, hysterical husband. It would have been a scene they could dine out on for weeks. No, my response had to be as cold and calculated as their betrayal. I had spent weeks laying this trap, piece by meticulous piece. I would not spoil the execution with raw emotion. This wasn't Lillian's first act of humiliation, merely her most public. For months, I had been an unwilling audience to her poorly written soap opera. The late nights that smelled of unfamiliar cologne. The whispered phone calls that ended the moment I entered a room. The sudden, fervent interest in spa weekends with friends whose names I'd never heard. At first, I did what love compels us to do. I made excuses. I told myself I was paranoid, insecure. Love is a potent anesthetic. It numbs you to the pain of your own instincts. The anesthesia wore off when I found the receipts. Not metaphorical receipts, but literal, damning slips of paper. Dinner for two at a Michelin-starred restaurant on a night she was supposedly working late. A hotel booking for a king suite under a pseudonym. A receipt from a high-end jeweler for a diamond bracelet I had never seen her wear. Even then, I hesitated. But one afternoon, I overheard her on the phone, her voice a low, intimate murmur. "I can't wait to see you again," she'd whispered. He has no idea. That was the moment the anesthetic turned to poison. I hired a private investigator, a quiet, methodical man named Arthur. What he uncovered was not mere infidelity. It was a conspiracy. Marcus wasn't just her lover. He was her co-conspirator. They had been systematically siphoning money from our joint accounts, small amounts at first, like cautious thieves testing the locks. But as their arrogance grew, so did their greed. Lillian had become so confident, so dismissive of me, that she'd stopped covering her tracks. It was almost as if she wanted me to find out, as if the thrill of the betrayal was heightened by the risk of discovery. She was walking a tightrope, and tonight, I was going to sever the rope, the net, and the poles holding it all up. I checked my watch. 2 minutes. I could feel their collective gaze on me, a mixture of irritation and a nascent, unacknowledged fear. My silence was a vacuum, and it was beginning to pull them in. Marcus leaned forward, his smirk returning, though it seemed a bit more forced now. "What's the matter, champ? Cat got your tongue? Or are you finally realizing you don't belong in the big leagues?" I took another sip of whiskey, letting his words ripple past me. My placid lake remained undisturbed. My lack of reaction was a language they didn't understand, and it was unnerving them. Lillian's friends, the braying chorus, were now whispering amongst themselves, their amusement curdling into discomfort. Even Lillian's bravado was beginning to fray at the edges. She hated not being in control, not being able to predict my next move. "What are you doing here, Michael?" she snapped, her voice sharper, a little higher. "You don't have the guts to confront me properly, so what's the plan? Sit there and pout like a child?" I finally glanced up, meeting her glare with a calm that seemed to physically push her back a step. "I'm just here to watch," I said. "Watch what?" she barked, her frustration boiling over. My tone was flat, almost bored. "Your world collapse." A brittle, forced laugh escaped her lips. "You're delusional." Perhaps, but I knew one thing she didn't. She was almost out of time. I had orchestrated every detail of this evening with surgical precision. The paramedics were already on standby a few blocks away, alerted to a potential mass medical emergency at this address. The police were en route, responding to an anonymous tip about fraudulent financial activity and a possible disturbance. And the drinks. Well, the drinks were the overture to the opera of chaos I was about to conduct. This wasn't about revenge. Revenge is a hot, messy emotion. It's about anger and bitterness. This was colder. This was about equilibrium. It was about demonstrating, in the most visceral way possible, that for every action, there is an equal and opposite consequence. 1 minute. I set my glass down on the polished wood of the end table and leaned back, letting that small, knowing smile return to my lips. They were too preoccupied with their own growing anxiety to notice the shift in my demeanor. "Why are you smiling?" Lillian demanded, her voice shaking just enough to betray the fear she was trying so desperately to hide. "You'll see," I said simply. 45 seconds. The tension in the room was now a physical thing, thick and suffocating. Marcus, finally shedding his smug persona, narrowed his eyes. The suspicion was plain on his face now. "What the hell is this, man?" he asked, his voice losing its arrogant edge. I didn't answer. Instead, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my knees, and made eye contact with each of them in turn, a silent, final judgment. "You've all had your fun," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, yet it carried to every corner of the silent room. "Now it's my turn." The first tremor in their perfect, arrogant world began with Marcus. He was in the middle of a condescending remark when his words caught in his throat. He leaned forward, a hand flying to his chest, his face contorting in a mask of pain and confusion. "What the?" he gasped, but the rest of the sentence was lost in a low, guttural groan as he doubled over. "Marcus!" Lillian's voice was a sharp crack in the stunned silence. She rushed to his side, her hands fluttering uselessly over his back. "What is it? What's wrong?" Before he could answer, the contagion spread. A woman in a glittering gold dress, one of the loudest laughers, let out a strangled cry, her own hand clawing at her throat. She staggered backward, her eyes wide with terror as she struggled for breath. "What's going on?" someone shouted from the back. Chaos erupted. It was a sudden, violent squall in a calm sea. The man who had been so eager to leave earlier dropped to his knees, gagging, his face turning a blotchy, alarming shade of red. A woman screamed and ran for the door, only to collapse in a heap, clutching her stomach. The room became a maelstrom of panic, gasps, cries, the sickening crash of a vase being knocked over, the scrape of furniture as people stumbled and fell. Lillian, her face a mask of terror, whipped her head back toward me. "Michael!" she shrieked, her voice breaking. "What's happening? What did you do?" I remained seated, an island of calm in her storm. I watched, my expression unreadable. Marcus was on the floor now, writhing, his earlier swagger reduced to desperate, wheezing gasps. "Help me," he choked out. "Somebody call 911. One of the few still standing fumbled for their phone, but their hands were trembling so badly it slipped from their grasp and clattered uselessly to the floor. Lillian was weeping now, real, terrified tears, not the crocodile tears she'd perfected for me. She knelt beside Marcus, shaking him as if the motion itself could ward off whatever was happening. "What's happening to you?" she sobbed. "What's happening to all of us?" Her friends, her loyal court, were now just frightened animals, their polished veneers stripped away to reveal the raw panic underneath. "Michael!" Lillian screamed again, her voice raw with desperation and fear. "Please, just tell me what's going on." I tilted my head, studying her as a biologist might study a creature in a cage. "You weren't very interested in what I had to say when I walked in," I said, my voice even. "Why the sudden curiosity?" She blinked, mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks. "This isn't funny. Marcus, her voice broke. I leaned forward, my voice dropping but carrying a new, hard edge. "It's not so entertaining now, is it, Lillian?" Her lips trembled. Behind her, another friend collapsed, their body convulsing slightly. The room was a symphony of fear. And then, faint at first, but growing steadily louder, came the sound I had been waiting for. The mournful, rising and falling wail of sirens. Lillian's head snapped up, a flicker of hope in her tear-filled eyes. "The paramedics," she cried, scrambling to her feet. "They'll fix this. They'll know what to do." "Will they?" I cut in, my voice slicing through her desperate hope. She froze, staring at me as if I had spoken in a foreign language. What do you mean?" I leaned back in my chair, folding my arms across my chest as flashing lights began to strobe against the windows, painting the chaos inside in frantic strokes of red and blue. "Do you really think this is something a paramedic can fix, Lillian? Do you think a little oxygen and an 4 drip can undo what you've done?" Her eyes widened, and in that moment, for the first time all night, I saw it. Not just fear, but the dawn of a much deeper, more terrifying understanding. The realization that she was not in control, that the game was over, and that she had lost. The first responders burst through the door, a wave of blue uniforms and grim, professional faces. They stopped short, taking in the scene of affluent chaos. "What happened here?" one of them demanded, kneeling beside the barely conscious Marcus. I stood up, slowly, brushing an imaginary piece of lint from my jacket. "That," I said, my voice calm and measured, "is a very long story. But let's just say they all got exactly what they deserved." Lillian stared at me, her face ghostly pale in the flashing lights, her lips trembling. "What did you do?" she whispered, the question barely audible over the frantic movements of the paramedics. I held her gaze for a long moment, letting the silence stretch, letting her hang in the abyss of her own making. "I gave you a taste of what it feels like to be powerless," I said finally. "And trust me, Lillian, we're just getting started." As the paramedics swarmed the room, their movements a blur of practiced urgency, I stood apart, the architect observing his finished work. They were checking pulses, administering oxygen, their voices a low murmur of medical jargon. They were confused. The victims' vitals were erratic, but not life-threatening. Their symptoms were dramatic, but their bodies weren't actually failing. Lillian, now a trembling wreck, followed one of the paramedics like a lost child. "Please," she sobbed, "you have to do something. He's dying." The paramedic, a woman with tired, no-nonsense eyes, shot her an irritated look. "Ma'am, his heart rate is elevated, but he's not dying. None of them are." She looked around the room, a deep frown on her face. "But they all think they are." That was Lillian's cue. She spun around, her eyes, wild and accusatory, locking onto mine. "You," she hissed, pointing a shaking finger. "You poisoned us. You insane bastard. You poisoned everyone." I let out a soft, humorless chuckle. "Poison? That's such an ugly word, Lillian. I'm not a monster." I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out a thick manila folder. "I'm just a man who believes in evidence." I walked to the center of the room, to the large glass coffee table now littered with overturned glasses. I opened the folder and took out the first sheet of paper, slapping it down on the glass with a sharp rap that cut through the noise. "This," I announced, my voice carrying a new, authoritative weight, "is a bank statement. From our joint account. Notice the highlighted transaction? A transfer of $10,000, made 3 weeks ago, to an account belonging to a Mr. Marcus Thorne." A collective gasp went through the room. Even the paramedics paused to look. Marcus, propped up against the sofa, turned a shade paler. Lillian's face crumpled. That was a loan," she stammered. "A loan?" I produced another document. "Is that what you call this?" "A receipt from a high-end jeweler for a man's watch. A Rolex. Paid for the day after the loan was made." I glanced at Marcus's wrist, where the watch gleamed under the light. Funny how that works. Marcus instinctively tried to hide his wrist, a pathetic, guilty gesture. I continued, my pace unhurried, laying out each piece of evidence like a prosecutor presenting his case. "And here," I said, placing another receipt on the table, "is a hotel bill. For a 2-night stay in the presidential suite at the Grand Haven. Booked under your favorite pseudonym, Laura Banks. You were supposed to be at a marketing conference in Chicago, remember?" Lillian stared at the paper, speechless. The story she had so carefully constructed was being dismantled, piece by painful piece, in front of an audience of strangers. "You thought you were so clever," I said, my voice dropping, becoming more personal, more venomous. "Skimming money, funding your little trysts, laughing behind my back. You thought I was a fool, an oblivious, trusting fool who would just keep funding your betrayal." "Michael, please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry. I'll pay it all back. I swear. Just make this stop. Stop." I laughed, a raw, bitter sound. This is just the beginning. At that moment, the second wave arrived. The front door swung open again, and two uniformed police officers walked in, their faces grim. The lead officer, a tall, imposing man, surveyed the scene. "We received an anonymous tip about fraudulent activity at this address." I smiled. "That would be me. And everything you need," I said, gesturing to the folder and the papers spread across the table, "is right here." The officer picked up the folder, his eyes scanning the first page. His jaw tightened. He looked from the papers to Lillian, then to Marcus. "This is serious," he said, his voice low and hard. Lillian's knees finally gave out. She sank to the floor, her body shaking with uncontrollable sobs. The confident, arrogant woman who had slapped me was gone, replaced by a broken, terrified shell. The officer looked at me. "And the medical situation?" "Ah, yes." I pulled a small, clear vial from my pocket. A little something a friend in chemistry whipped up for me. A powerful psychosomatic agent. Harmless, but it induces all the physical symptoms of a severe panic attack. The mind is a powerful thing, officer. If it believes it's dying, the body will follow suit. I looked around at the pale, trembling faces. They just needed a little push. The officer stared at me for a long moment, his expression a mixture of shock and a grudging, almost imperceptible respect. He took the vial. "Michael," Lillian whispered from the floor, her voice a broken plea. "Why?" I crouched down, meeting her gaze one last time. There was no anger left in me, only a vast, cold emptiness where my love for her used to be. "Because you needed to learn, Lillian. You and your friends. You needed to feel, just for an hour, what it's like to have your world fall apart. To be utterly, completely powerless." I stood up and turned to the officer. "I'm ready to give my full statement." As they led Marcus away in handcuffs, he shot me a look of pure hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. "Oh, it is," I replied calmly. "It was over the moment you decided my wife was your personal ATM." They escorted Lillian out next. She didn't fight. She didn't even speak. She just walked, a ghost in an expensive dress, her face a blank mask of devastation. As she passed me, her eyes met mine one last time. They held no anger, no defiance. Only the hollow, echoing ruin of a life she had torched with her own hands. The cool night air was a balm on my skin as I stepped out of that house. The flashing lights, the radios crackling, the low murmur of official voices. It all felt distant, like a scene from a movie I was no longer a part of. Inside, the life I had known was being catalogued as a crime scene. Out here, under the vast, indifferent sky, my new life was just beginning. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was exactly as I had planned. Swift, brutal, and absolute. The story of Lillian and Marcus's spectacular implosion became the stuff of local legend, a cautionary tale whispered at dinner parties and country clubs. Lillian, stripped of her social standing and facing fraud charges, became a pariah. Marcus, whose web of deceit turned out to be far more extensive than just my bank account, was staring down a future of courtrooms and, most likely, a small, government-issued room. Their circle of friends, those brave laughers, scattered like roaches in the light, each one disavowing any real knowledge of the affair, desperate to avoid the taint of the scandal. I filed for divorce the next morning. It was a clean, quiet affair. There was no battle. Lillian, advised by her lawyer that she had no leverage, signed everything without a fight. The evidence was irrefutable. She was broken. The house, our house, I sold it without ever stepping foot inside again. It was a mausoleum of lies, and I wanted no part of its ghosts. With the proceeds, I bought a small, unassuming place on the other side of town, a place with old trees and a quiet street, a place that felt like mine and mine alone. Months later, I was sitting on my new porch. The evening was cool, and the sky was a deep, star-dusted indigo. A glass of good whiskey, my own this time, sat on the small table beside me. The man who had walked into that party, the quiet, trusting husband, was gone. He had died in that living room, amidst the wreckage of a smashed cake and scattered orchids. Wait, no, that was a different story, a different man's pain. My story had no cake, no flowers. It had a slap and laughter and a vial of carefully engineered fear. The man who remained was different. Harder, perhaps. Wiser, certainly. A man who understood that sometimes the only way to deal with a fire is not to fight it, but to let it burn itself out, and then to calmly, methodically, sift through the ashes for anything worth saving. I had saved myself. I took a sip of whiskey, the smoky warmth spreading through my chest. I thought of Lillian, not with anger or pity, but with a profound and final indifference. She was a chapter one had finished reading. The book of my life was still open, and there were so many blank pages left to write. Staring up at the silent, watching stars, I raised my glass. To new beginnings, I thought. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt like a promise, not a threat.